Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait a few minutes as people come in. Come on in, make yourself comfortable into our virtual lounge here. Pull up a seat, grab a drink. While we're waiting, maybe if you could just tell me where you're joining us from today. It'd be great to see where everybody is from. Just in the chat bar below, type in where you're joining us from. Maybe your city, or maybe it's your living room. Just tell us where you are so I know you're here. It's so good to be able to interact with people. So it's nice to see that. So would love to hear from you. Just type it into the chat bubble. I know it sometimes is a bit of a delay. Oh, we're seeing Marcelina, who is here in Toronto. Welcome, Marcelina. Yes, and make sure to open your chat up to all panelists and attendees so that way everybody can see your chat. Who else is here? I know we got a few of you here. So we've got Landon from Edmonton. Oh, and he's in his, I think it's a he, and I'm sorry if I might be a woman, but you're in your lonely office, I see. I know what that feels like. And Catherine is here from Toronto. Thank you all for joining us. Okay, well, we're going to get started. So thank you all for coming. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Andrea Sampson. I'm the CEO of Talk Boutique and your host and moderator of today's Sense-Making Conversations. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so happy to have you here. Well, the world seems to be coming alive, doesn't it? I know spring seems to be in the air, but I know we did have some snow recently. It is Canada, come on. You know, we can't go through a May without at least a couple of snowflakes. But with the nicer weather, we're hearing reports of some companies getting ready to open their doors and to refocus themselves as the virus slows its pace here in Canada. It's really good news. And pace is something that has been an important topic for the past few months. We've heard a lot about the pace of the virus, and the pace of business, the pace of education, and the pace of supply chains. And there's lots that we've heard on all of those. But as these conversations have been unfolding, many of us are beginning to adjust to that decentralized working relationship that we're all now having with coworkers and our businesses. You know, some of us are working from our lonely offices. Some of us are working in very busy homes with kids behind us, but we are in a decentralized place. And as these conversations are getting underway, decentralization has been a hot topic. And it was a hot topic prior to the pandemic with the entrenchment of blockchain technology. Now, we often heard about cryptocurrency and how blockchain would interrupt our currency system. Blockchain and decentralizing power was being examined for government services like passports and other identification services. Now, I get to wear a lot of hats as the CEO, and I work with a whole lot of different speakers. And so I was often on conversations prior to the pandemic where we were imagining the decentralization of governments themselves and the impact that global governance versus nation state governance might have. It was heady times. Yeah, that was about 3 months ago. But here we are now, a global pandemic underway, and some of those conversations are actually having way more relevance now. Blockchain technology is beginning to be used in new ways to decentralize systems that have impact. During the pandemic, supply chains, education, governance, these are all things that we're beginning to hear about. And that's why I am so incredibly excited to introduce you to today's guest. Anne Connolly is passionate about harnessing blockchain and decentralization technology to transform the lives of people in developing countries. Anne is faculty at Singularity University in Silicon Valley and at Singularity U here in Canada. She teaches global leaders how exponential technologies can solve the problems that impact billions of people. Anne has been an active part of the global blockchain community since 2012. And that's a lifetime in blockchain years. I just want to put that out there. Anne is the founder of Trust Graphic Novels and is currently writing a graphic novel to share the impact of blockchain communities on the globe, with the goal of reaching over 1 million African youth. She has a Bachelor of Life Sciences from Queen's, an MBA from McMaster, and a FinTech certificate from MIT. Anne was honored as CBC's 12 Young Leaders Changing Canada and one of the 50 most inspirational women in Canadian technology. We are truly honored to have Anne with us today. Our agenda for the next 45 minutes is for Anne to take us through the concept of decentralization and blockchain technology for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, followed by an interactive conversation where you get to ask questions. So make sure you put your questions in the chat bubble below. Do that while she's talking so you don't lose those questions, because I know there's going to be lots that we want to talk to Anne about. Now, without further delay, Anne, help us to understand blockchain technology and how it will decentralize much of what we know and why that's important.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me today. And thanks to everyone who's taken the time out of what are probably very crazy days if you have children and joining us today. So one of the things that I've heard a lot in and around COVID is, what does the new future look like? Is it open? Is it closed? Is it halfway there? How do we reimagine what our society is going to look like once this virus starts to subside and we can start going out again? And so I think this is a really interesting time that we've been given as a society to actually completely stop and say, hey, what would we make our society look like if we could redesign it? What would it look like? And we've already started making some of those changes, changes like virtual work, for example, something that many companies fought against for so long are now forced to do and are seeing, hey, this works actually a lot better than we thought it would. And maybe this is something that we can continue into this new future. And so a lot of things that people have been saying as well is looking at our society and how some of our larger structures have been working or not working in times of COVID. And many people are looking around, particularly in the US, and saying, this system that we've built is just not working for the vast majority of people, and saying maybe this is the time to actually do a bit of a redesign. And so to kind of think about what the future might look like, you have to think about how we've built up our society today. And that's really based on centralized models. And so essentially, if you think about all the interactions that we have between people around the world on a daily basis, most of those use some kind of centralized body in the middle of them. So either, say, a government or a corporation that is helping us make that transaction or helping us make that connection with people around the world. And this is actually a really incredible type of system because it enables us to scale quite significantly by creating these efficiencies, right? So if you have one large corporation that is handling a certain volume of transactions or whatever type of interaction that is, you can actually do that at a much larger scale than if you were doing it, say, peer-to-peer. And so when you think about our society, most things that we do every day use these types of centralized intermediaries. But the challenge with these centralized structures and centralized systems is that they work really well until they don't. And because there's a single point of failure, that one centralized body, if that breaks down, then everything starts to break down around you. And we're kind of starting to see that with a lot of the governments who are mismanaging this COVID system or this COVID response, where, because the system has been built up the way it is, once you get one incompetent or corrupt politician or one person who's not managing things properly, then the entire structure falls apart. And so this is where we need to start looking at more decentralized systems that actually take the power away from these particular sources and spread it out to across communities across the world, which is kind of exciting. And so really what this is about is not so much the systems, but how do you create trust between people who are transacting with one another? And so historically, these centralized governments or corporations would create this trust. But moving forward, we need to start thinking about what are other ways that we can create trust between individuals or other groups connecting around the world that don't require these centralized bodies who may themselves not be super trustworthy. And so one of the cool things that's happening in innovation worlds and in the blockchain world is looking at how can you create decentralized systems that still have that distribution of power that ideally we'd be looking for to remove those single points of failure, but also at the same time have the benefits of the scaling potential that we had with the centralized bodies. And so this is kind of what we're looking at. And so these types of systems we're looking at in terms of financial systems, supply chain, governance structures, education, all of these sort of foundational level institutions that we're so used to having and having very stable and not changing. These are the types of systems that we're looking to change through these new decentralized models. So I'm pretty excited to dive into a few examples of what those might look like. And yeah, maybe Andrea, do we want to start on healthcare, so seeing as it's such a hot topic these days? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you for that. That's it's helpful, I think, to be able to contextualize and to understand what these two things are. I mean, blockchain versus decentralization, and how the technology itself can empower the idea of decentralization. And when we look at healthcare, I mean, we're starting to hear blockchain pop up in a whole lot of different ways. Certainly, we saw some of that happen recently with supply chain of masks, and we saw it we were seeing it with medical records as well. So tell me a little bit about how can the medical system really benefit from the decentralizing power of blockchain?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, like decentralization in healthcare is not new. It is a well-known way to increase access to care. So a good example of how decentralization was used is in HIV treatment in the early 2000s. So in Malawi in particular, they were a real forerunner in this. Their early HIV treatment was very centralized in a few key hospitals. And in the early stages, that enabled them to get some treatment out, but it really didn't enable all the people living in rural villages to access care because they couldn't get to that central point. And so they started to actually decentralize care out of these hospitals and into clinics all across the country so that they could reach as many people as possible. So in the end, they were duplicating a lot of the work in all of these different clinics, but as a result, the care went up and people's health went up. And so it's not a new concept in healthcare, but I think in and around COVID, it's becoming a hot topic again, particularly in and around, say, control over personal protective equipment or PPE. So I know in the United States, they have a national stockpile, which great, creates this amazing efficiency where, one national body is organizing this huge stockpile instead of every state. But what happened is with Trump at the helm, because he wasn't trustworthy, he was the single point of failure, he actually was refusing to send personal protective equipment out to the different states, or would send it to states that he liked and ones that he didn't. And so all of a sudden you see the system that historically worked well didn't work well at all in a case where there was a lack of trust. And so that's a great example of where, having more decentralized systems where states themselves are able to order and manage their own supply chains, that could actually help significantly with the health system.
Well, that leads us right into, a sort of the bigger issue, and one that, it's one that I always love talking about. I mean, that example you just gave with Trump stopping the flow into states, of course, we experienced that here with the flow into Canada, with the situation where they were stopped at the border and recalled. And it gets into, so for me, where that takes us right into, and I think, sort of the heart of where decentralization really can make impact, which is global governance versus nation state governance. And here we start to see where decentralization can start to help us on a global level. And certainly with the pandemic, we're living this real time right now. It's not just about PPE being stopped at borders, but we're seeing countries now making different choices on how they're addressing the pandemic. So talk a little bit about how blockchain can help enable a global governance system.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like you say, as we see, you know, historically our governance structures were specifically for nation states. And as we grow and as we globalize, you know, the impact of one country on another is even more significant than it ever was. So this doesn't just apply to healthcare and viruses. It applies to water use and pollution and climate change and all these other really key issues. And so what we really need to start to look at is how can you recreate governance models so that they're more collaborative, more community oriented, and more, again, decentralized. As we've seen over the past decade, like the concentration of power in the world is increasing, and that's quite a scary thing for, you know, countries or communities that are at the mercy of those organizations. And so when you look at, say, the UN or other large scale cross-national governance structures, are they actually achieving what we want them to achieve? And so there's incredible new structures that we're creating in the blockchain world. One of them is called the DAO. It's a decentralized autonomous organization, DAO. And essentially what it does is it enables groups of individuals or communities or nation states, however you want to structure it, to make decisions using smart contracts without ever needing really to meet or connect, or it's really kind of cool. And all those decisions are recorded in an automated fashion. So let's say that you wanted to vote. Well, many of the initial DAOs that are coming out now are based on distribution of money. So a lot of them are venture capital funds, or they're granting programs, charitable granting programs. And so everyone who's included in that voting structure can read the proposals of what comes through and then vote on whether they want them to go forward. And once that vote is made, an automatic transfer of the funds goes to the winner of the vote. And so I think these are the sorts of technologies and restructurizations that can give some of these smaller countries or smaller communities more power based on the sort of automation of decisions through these structures, which is kind of exciting.
Well, that just sparked a whole lot of questions for me. And I think, questions and observations. I mean, so this idea of, being able to decide where funds go, as an example, as we're living through this pandemic, but what will come from, after it. And many of us are, working with governments through funding support. So look, there's a lot of people who are here in Canada accessing much of the government support. So it sounds like decentralization that blockchain brings along could help us with some of this, so that it would alleviate, as an example, some of the roadblocks that come at trying to get your information into the right place, and being able to decide, does everybody get the same amount, as an example with the CERB, versus those who might get different amounts based upon maybe there's, because of the transparency of the blockchain ledger. Am I hearing that correctly?
It's possible. I think where I could see applications of blockchain in terms of this type of distribution is just through smart contracts. So you say you would take people's tax returns, and a smart contract could automatically distribute funds to people who had, X number of income or whatever it was. I think we're a little ways away from that in terms of government adoption and implementation. But where I could see some of this really working is at the community level. You say you've got a small municipality, or you have a neighborhood, and there's, say, the government could download $100,000 or what have you that can be spent on community projects to help reinvigorate the economy post-COVID. Where does that community actually want those funds to go? So if the government was doing it, it might be quite blanket, every person gets $2,000, whatever it is. But a community might decide, together, actually, it's more important for us to get the pool open so everyone can use it, or it's more important that this like cornerstone restaurant that's been there for 50 years gets supported first and brings the community back together. And so it sort of enables this ability for communities to vote and coordinate at a scale that wasn't previously possible, or that didn't have the risk of centralized failure within it. You know, to say there's one politician who's making this, one local politician who's making this decision, and it doesn't really represent everyone. You know, I think our governance structures are based on models that were created in the 1700s, when you had to ride on a horse to come together to make decisions with other people. And so this sort of direct representative model worked a lot more effectively, whereas now, you know, the voice of all the people in a community can be heard very easily through the internet. It's just a matter of harnessing that.
That's really interesting. And it, you know, that starts to come, for me, it brings up the concept of education. And, you know, we've got, you know, many people working from home right now, children, of course, at home with their parents, and parents being asked to substitute in for being teachers. It's happening a lot. How could blockchain help with that? How can it help with education?
This is one of probably the most exciting areas of education. And I come from a family of teachers, so I hear a lot about the complaints of the current system. But I think one of the most critical things is just that the system hasn't changed at all. You know, our world has evolved a lot since the 1900s, and our education system not so much. And really the thing that I think a lot of parents are learning right now is that education comes in all formats. You know, just because you're not sitting at a desk, you know, doing rote memorization of some dictate list or something, doesn't mean your kids aren't learning. Are they learning to bake bread? Are they learning about, you know, money? Are they learning how to run a household? These are all really critical elements of the education of the whole person, and not just, you know, the education of the mind. And what's happening in blockchain is sort of this recognition that historically degrees and diplomas and this educational credentialing was held in these centralized systems. So you get it from this one centralized university or this one college, and they're the only people that can grant you these degrees. Whereas, you know, there's a lot of people out there that don't have degrees, but have incredible, vast amounts of knowledge that are much better, but are totally uncertified in any way. And so there's a really cool project actually out of Dubai. They've got the Smart City University, where the whole concept is all these other elements that you do in your life. Maybe it's a workshop or some kind of training program that's kind of off-brand or something. You know, all these things that you do in your life can add credits essentially to your identity. So it's, you know, as me as a person, I've done all of these things, and all of those will give me credit towards, you know, a broader university degree or whatever type of certification it is. And so it's sort of the concept of how do you broaden what it means to have education or be credentialed for education, but then how do you actually give those credits for that work in a way that is more transparent and open. And so people can essentially get all these get credit for the work that they're doing all the time. And so I see with a lot of the children doing COVID right now, you know, maybe they're not studying math or English per se, but they are learning. And so how do they get credit for that time that they're putting in?
That's really interesting. I mean, so I just want to make sure I'm hearing that correctly. You know, especially if I look at parents who are at home right now, and I know one of the biggest challenges, especially with young children, is getting them to be on the computer, on those, you know, whether it be Google Classroom or Microsoft Teams or one of the many other softwares that's being used to manage the educational system right now. And so getting these young children to spend their time on these educational platforms is difficult. You know, first of all, it's difficult getting kids to go to school. Let's face it, right? Like, it's not their most favorite thing often. But here's the thing, they probably are on the computer and they're doing other things. That's the point. So what I love about what you're saying, and what I think is really important for our listeners to hear, is that this type of technology could track some of that. And, you know, many of these kids are watching educational videos on YouTube as an example, or they might be playing video games, but video games that have learning technology built into them. And so it could be watching what they're doing and actually creating school credits out of it. So the child gets gets to do one of the things that they love to do, the parent can feel good that their child is learning, and the educational system can get the proof that this is actually happening. So it's sort of a win-win-win on all sides. I mean, that's really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what it also does is democratizes access to formalized education in a sense. So, if you weren't able to afford going to college or university before, but were quite a bright individual, now you can do that work on free internet platforms, get the information that you need, and then get the credentials in this whole new way that you weren't able to access historically.
Well, I mean, so to your point, I mean, it has, yes, it has implications for children still in school, but it might have implications for me,
Yeah.
like, and for you, like, because as we do all of the learning that we all, so many of us are watching TED Talks or watching SU talks, right? These suddenly start to hold the educational credit that they have in value, because here that's, I think, has been the challenge for so long, is that there's lots of educational value out there that many of us access, but we're not necessarily seeing the credit on the other side of it. So what an interesting concept. And yeah. That's a great example of decentralization at work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think the real benefits of decentralization of education are the internet made a huge impact on, people being able to access whatever type of information all over the world for as close to free as you could possibly get it. Yeah. But again, there's still this barrier around the credentialing. And I think once we can get past that and, enable the validation of that education, then I think that's when we'll really see the difference.
I mean, this has big implications for schools and universities, right? And here's how we start to look at, okay, the cost of university, what happens, do people still go to university? Are we looking at this kind of decentralized, society where we all are not just, working, but, educating from home? Is that, like, I can imagine that there's, some challenges with that as well.
Yeah, like I would predict that, through the decentralization of education, you're going to start to see the breakdown of these like monolithic universities, say University of Toronto, which is enormous, to actually have these much smaller local campuses that could teach you things that, say, are much more difficult to do out of university structure. So say scientific lab courses or whatever that might happen to be. But, you'll start to see these really small micro opportunities where you can go in and take one lab class or something and get the credit that you need close to home, as opposed to having to travel or move away. So again, you'll see the benefits of all of this on particularly more rural communities, on people who historically, would have to travel quite far and spend a lot more money to go to a university, can now do a lot more of that close to home.
So, as I think about decentralization, one of the ways in which we are all staying connected in this decentralized world that we're currently living in is social media. And, I'm wondering, like, what impact could blockchain have on social media? And is it something that we should even be thinking about?
Oh, absolutely. Again, this is one of the biggest areas, I think, where blockchain will truly have an impact on human rights and freedom. So in a lot of countries, we see massive levels of censorship, either by government or by corporations. In fact, recently, throughout COVID, we've seen, I think, a level of censorship around COVID information on platforms like YouTube and Twitter that, quite frankly, I find very scary, that, a centralized corporation will just crack down and say, well, we don't agree with the information that you're putting out about COVID, we're taking it down. And what we've seen with some of that is that, they've taken down information that may initially seem a little bit like conspiracy theory-esque, only to find out a couple weeks later that, it's the top headline in the Washington Post, and it really wasn't a conspiracy theory, it was actually real. And so I think there's a real danger to putting we've decentralized media now to social media where everyone can do it. But I think there's a real danger of shutting off particular voices and essentially getting this kind of groupthink around what's happening in the world. And so there's a real push to have more decentralized models of social media where the ability for a government to say crack down on messaging on these platforms wouldn't be possible. So if you had a government per se that forced, say, a centralized social media platform like Twitter or Facebook to remove any information about, say, a human rights atrocity that they committed, then that kind of gets erased from the history of that community. And that's a really scary and dangerous thing. But with a decentralized model, instead of having like one company the government could go to have them remove that information, all of these messages are stored on thousands of computers all over the world, and so could never really be turned off. And so we're seeing these types of systems being used in a lot of anti-government protests. In Hong Kong, they used a lot of these types of messaging systems to get information out, which has been great. But I think the real key thing is, getting decentralized messaging and then getting access to internet that also can't be turned off by government, because that's a really key baseline level for all of these technologies to work.
Yeah, I think we've seen some of that happening right in the past, and certainly with, the level of social media interaction that's happening with our government now, and I think that's something that, as we see governments becoming more accountable through these types of transparencies, the fact of not being able to remove them is incredibly important, as they make one claim and then claim it never happened, right? Because we see that happening all the time.
Yeah,
that's
we've seen that a lot recently, actually, in and around the WHO and China and their statistics and these sorts of things. And that's where I think, what we're living through right now is a perfect example of the dangers of centralization and putting trust in, these large international bodies that are susceptible to pressure from international governments. If you're really putting at risk massive numbers of human lives because you're forced to trust information from a body that isn't all that trustworthy, that's a very scary thing, to put your life at risk because of corruption of that style.
Yeah, absolutely. Blockchain and decentralization are really touching many places, in terms of the way in which we live, the way in which we work, the way in which we interact and socialize. And certainly, as many of us are having to physically distance, one of the challenges has been, and will continue to go on post this pandemic, is the question of the, our ability to touch things that have been touched by other humans. And, decentralization, and I know, through some of the work that you and I have done over the past couple of years, I know that decentralization can have a role to play in terms of creating smart machines. So talk to us a little bit about, sort of the delivery process that we might be able to see in the future, or the ways in which machines could use blockchain.
Yeah, this is one of the biggest areas of blockchain. I say that for every example. This is so big. I'm so excited, but it's really true. It's really looking at the connection between blockchain and IoT, or Internet of Things. So kind of the smartification of all the machines in your home. So of course you've heard the example of, smart fridges and smart dishwashers and smart washing machines. But the main barrier for these types of machines to really start to take over the world is that human beings sit as centralized intermediaries between them being able to transact with one another. And so once we start to disintermediate humans out of that process, you get these smart machines can actually start to interact with each other. So a good example would be if you have, say, a self-driving car that picks you up in the morning, it can actually start to pay streetlights to turn green so it can go faster, or it can pay tolls automatically to the city to drive in fast lanes, can pay the cars around it to move aside if it wants to go, in a particular lane. And that's where we're going to start to see, this incredible level of society that never existed before, where there's this whole element of robots that are interacting in a particular way. And I think one of my favorite examples, I was at a meetup, this was actually 3 or 4 years ago now, where they created a drone that would be a delivery drone that would pick up a package that, you know, was ordered, and it would fly to the second story window of your house. And the window, because it was a robot with sensors, would actually interact with the drone, verify the identity of the drone was the correct one delivering the package that day, open the window, the drone would fly in, drop the package, and fly out. And then a smart contract would trigger payment for the receipt of the object. So there's some really, I think, some fun applications of blockchain that we're going to start to see, where as we do start to perhaps move out of these urban centers and, you know, things are more decentralized, where the services that we love and expect to have, like fast delivery and you know, not having human contact, if that's what we need to do for the next little while, I think blockchain will be able to help a lot with that.
Mm. So I just want to, I want to address a couple of things there. So first of all, the drone delivering into my window. So let me just get this straight. So if I maybe had a little bit too much to drink on a Friday night, I don't even have to worry about getting my credit card out, is what you're telling me, that the pizza can be delivered to my 5th floor condo with just one call. So that's pretty cool.
And the best part is, you know, it doesn't even have to be you that's ordering the pizza. Maybe it's your refrigerator, you know, maybe
even better.
Your car is ordering its own parts, or, you know, whatever it is. So there's there's some pretty fun potential there.
And I think the other thing that I know, you know, as someone who drives a lot and in Toronto, the idea that, you know, my car could pay to get me to where I need to go quicker, that's a really great idea. That's all I'm going to say. Those green lights, you know, because we all know what it's like to miss that one green light, and the next thing you know, the next 20 are red. So, wow, how to be able to impact that? That's a world that sounds like
it
fun.
gives people the agency, I think, to make micro decisions throughout their day. You know, where it is. Maybe at one point in time, it's really important for me to get there, and I'll pay more money to do that. Or on another chance, it's, you know, I could make a little bit of money this morning by showing up 2 minutes later, and kind of get, I think it's really about the microtization of decisions, and the ability to do that with microtransactions, because with cryptocurrencies and blockchain, you can do that. You can really cheaply and easily send minute transactions of, you know, less than a penny. Whereas with our traditional system, you know, if you wanted to send 25 cents on a Visa card, you're paying, you know, 200% just to do that, because there's, you know, probably a 25-cent fee plus a percentage. And so it's going to enable this whole new level of decision making and transactions that we've never been able to do before.
So we've got a couple of questions coming in. So Marcelina is asking, and I want to make sure I've got this right. She's saying, in a decentralized system, how can an idiosyncratic idea like injecting disinfectant be compared to data-driven ones? And so I think, you know, I think there's an interesting idea there of, you know, can decentralization, you know, use data to help with some of these, you know, things that are perhaps not so, let's call them a good idea, not a good idea.
That's an interesting question. And I think this comes back even perhaps more so to the wisdom of the crowds. And so the ultimate decentralization of knowledge, where, you know, if you get knowledge from, say, a group of 4 people, your answer will be fine. But if you get knowledge from a group of, you know, 100 or 1,000 or 100,000 people, the response that you will come to is typically most closest to the correct response. And so I think it's going to be less, I haven't decided if I'm excited about this feature or not, but I think our future will be less about actual data and actually finding the right answer, but more, how do you believe in the knowledge of the entire community around you to come to the same or as close a conclusion as possible that the data would have given you anyway. And so I think it's going to change, you know, like we're seeing this increasing mistrust of science, which, you know, I'm a scientist. I believe in science 100%. There's a lot of fraud in science. There's a lot of academic dishonesty. There's a lot of issues with that system. And there's actually some really cool blockchain-based systems that are decentralized around answering questions and getting, crowdsourcing science. So let's say, I don't have a full laboratory, but I could do some data collection to support a particular research project. I could now do that in, again, these little micro work opportunities. So instead of now where if you're doing a research study, you've got your team, they do the entire thing, they publish it, they have their own incentives around why they're doing that or why they might manipulate data in one way or another. But with open systems, you could have people all over the world, these citizen scientists contributing to these particular research studies, and then have the data be totally open as well. So anybody who wants to verify it or rework the data in different ways can do it. There was one study, and I can't remember exactly what it was about, but it was an economic study that led to massive policy changes at the federal level. That was found out later that when they looked at the full data set, that the researchers had forgot to extend their Excel highlight to include a couple more data points, and it changed the entire outcome of the study. But because no one had seen that back-end data, it couldn't be verified. And so I think it's really more so going to be about open systems, and then how are you rewarding or how are you incentivizing the hundreds of thousands of people that might support that actual research. So I think what I hope is that you'll see an increased trust in science and in the data that comes out. But then also, this ability to tap into the wisdom of the entire world instead of just, the people around you.
Yeah, that's powerful. I mean, that's really powerful, especially where, we have to trust in governments and, in this particular case, who, are clearly flawed. I mean, all humans, we all are flawed. And our governments, we hold them to a higher standard. And yet often what's happening right now is that they are putting information out that isn't always fully verified, or in some cases, safe or ethical. And so, having that open transparency allows for, people who have less access to information to have that access to information. Mm-hmm. I mean, some of us, would look at, injecting disinfectant and say that's clearly something I would never do. But look, there's a lot of people who have deep trust in government, and mm-hmm. having, being able to see some of that data is really, I think, important. So there's one more question, and I think we'll finish. So the question is quite long, so I'll read it. This comes from one of our attendees. Customers are upset their business interruption insurance does not cover COVID-related shutdowns. In addition, some government and groups in the US are threatening lawsuits to force insurance companies to pay business interruption claims due to COVID, even though pandemics are an exclusion. How could blockchain prevent the lawsuits and mistrust in the future? And how can it create more transparency and clarity around what the contract covers and what needs to happen to make this a reality?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, insurance is a huge industry for blockchain and its ability to disrupt. So one of these areas is very specifically around like the automation of payments based on oracles. So like an oracle is just an outside piece of information that you get from somewhere. So some of the insurance applications that are happening are in and around like crop insurance, for example. So you could get a system where your insurance payment is based on a smart contract. So the contract would check the weather every day on a specific website. And if that weather said, hey, there was a hailstorm in this region, it would automatically pay out to those individuals by smart contract. So there would be no way to really manipulate whether or not it gets paid out, other than if, the oracle itself was untrustworthy, which is possible. In this case, I mean, I think when you get down to the nitty gritty of what's covered and what's not covered, that's more of a policy decision than, say, blockchain. What you could do, though, is actually have the policy posted on a blockchain. So you could say, like, here's the policy the day that I bought it. And so the insurance companies wouldn't be able to go back and hide that policy. And then when you made a claim, say, oh, it's not in your policy anymore. so that you know exactly what you've bought, and there's no way for them as the centralized body to be able to change what you purchased. But in this case, I mean, if pandemics weren't covered, then they're not covered. So it's sort of like, to me, I don't see this as a fraudulent situation for the insurance companies. They're following through on what they agreed on. Although these are very extenuating circumstances, where I think also, you know, in cases like this, where say something isn't covered, but it is destroying communities, community level insurance is something that could be really cool to investigate. So you just say, you know, okay, all these people are going to pay into this community insurance pot. And you could create your own rules and regulations around what it covers and what it doesn't. And then, you know, you would get an automatic payout if everyone in the insurance community that you've created votes that it's a reasonable item to pay out. And so that's again, it would be like a kind of DAO structure that you could create to sort of make these stopgaps for places where traditional insurance companies just won't cover you.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for joining us today, Anne. You've really, I think you've opened a lot of minds around what blockchain is and how it can help us as we move into the future. I mean, looking through the lens of whether it be healthcare or governance or you know, smart contracts, these are all really big concepts that are difficult, I think, from the outset to understand. And so you've really helped us to clarify it. Thank you.
No, thanks for having me.
and thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. If you're interested in learning more about blockchain or would like to have Anne as part of one of your corporate events, Anne is always happy to come and do her keynote or an interactive workshop with your team. So you can reach out to us and we can make that happen for you. Now, next week, we're taking the week off from our Changemaker 20 sessions, but we will have a sense-making conversation 1 week from now, next Friday, with Karen Ward. Karen is an expert in the area of curiosity, and what curiosity does is it drives innovation. So she's going to take us through the concept of how you fuel the innovation engine by using curiosity. It's going to be an absolutely delightful talk. Karen is one of my favorite people when it comes to creativity and curiosity. She runs something called My Curious Eyes, which I've been part of for many years, where you get to go and look at everyday objects differently. And it fuels, again, that creative engine. So that is all we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay connected, and we'll see you next week. Take care.